So again, good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us. I think we started a new tradition with this June learning series, and we'll make sure to follow through it every year. So we started it last week, or I think it was 2 weeks ago, talking about June as the Pride Month, and today is actually connected to another tradition we started at Pando Logic. And I don't know how many people on this call were with us when we started it way back in December, when we actually decided to share and kind of expand the knowledge of people because we're working in a multicultural company. So we wanted to expand the knowledge of people of each other's culture, holidays, traditions, and anything around that area. So this is actually, this is part of it. And for me, Darrell and I just spoke a little bit. I'm very, very excited of this specifically, to hear and to learn more about it. And I think you probably all know what this day stands for, but we asked Darrell to tell us a little bit more about what does it mean to actually make this day an official federal holiday. What is the purpose of that? How does it affect and reflect on this day in a more general matter, I might say. So Darrell, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today and tell us about this day.
Thank you, first of all, I just want to say, for listening, not just hearing me, because I do think there's a difference between hearing and listening. So thank you. Good morning to everyone, I guess, here in America. Shalom to everyone in Israel. So nobody can say I did not speak Hebrew throughout this. It's really an honor to be able to share this. It's one thing for me to talk to people that I don't know, but it's another thing for me to be able to be at a company that I value, around people that that I work with, to share something that's close to my heart. And as you'll see, this goes beyond Juneteenth and really speaks to where we are today, just as a nation and as a world, and what it means for human nature. So let me start by first just saying thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Terry for before it had been a federal holiday. I know now we're it's in the process of things being signed and it's pretty much a done deal. But even before that happened, Terry took the time to say that this would be a moment to be set aside. And I think that says something about the culture of the company and about the forward thinkingness of, where we can go. Also want to say, when Dekla said, well, he's not going to be here today, I said, oh, really? So I can really say what I want. I think about the lady that she confronted her friend. She said, I heard you were talking about me behind my back. Why would you talk about me behind my back? And she said, well, because it's more freeing, when you're right in front of me, it's harder. So, but all jokes aside, I appreciate the opportunity to share beyond, I talked a little bit last year. For those, by show of hands, how many were here last year when I shared a little bit last year? Okay, so last year I spoke a little bit after the George Floyd murder and just what was going on in this country. And I shared then that it's difficult to come to work, and I kind of want to start with this, and compartmentalize. We tend to think that we can. But I think what the pandemic showed is that we're still all humans. We don't just bring our bodies and even our minds to work. We bring our spirits. We bring the essence of who we are. So, I think it's great to have the seminars where we're intellectually being fed and we're talking about how to be better workers and how to be more productive. But I really value these spaces where we can have conversations about things that really touch the fabric and the heart of who we are. In America, for those of you in Israel who've never been here or perhaps don't know much about America, I will tell you that there is no more divisive, controversial issue than the narrative of race. It is pervasive. It wasn't until I started traveling overseas that I realized just how jaded we are by race in this country. So I thought long and hard about what I would share today, because I did not want to lose people. This is not going to be a lecture on the wrongs of the American government against, African-American people. So people can breathe a sigh of relief. This is not one of those. It's not going to be a rah-rah, because that would not accomplish the means here. My intention here is really to have a conversation, and I'm only going to share comments for maybe about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I want to open it up to hear what people say. So just have a dialogue about, what does Juneteenth mean beyond the context of just race? What does it mean for our world? And what does it mean for Panda Logic? And more specifically, where we are personally. What does this mean? Because I want to pull on a few threads here. The first thing that I guess I'll just do this. I'll start with a story. I grew up in Baltimore City, and then I moved to Virginia when I was about 12 years old. So that was shocking to me, because Baltimore City, though, it's poverty and, drug sort of epidemic and all those things, I had never really dealt with racism, because I was only around Black folk, for lack of a better word. When I moved to Virginia, Newport News, it was the first time that first of all, it's the first time I saw a Confederate flag. I was like, oh, for real? Like, this still happens? We still have these? I really thought it was something that was just in the movies. And it was the first time that I was, called the N-word. And I don't mean nice. I'm talking about the other N-word. And it was more surprising, I won't even say it was angering first. It was more surprising that there were, because the person who called me that was, and I shared this the last year when I, shared my comments, he was living in the trailer park with me, and he was barefooted. So I'm like, if you're better than me, then we really need to have a serious discussion. So it opened up my eyes, though, to the world in a different way. And I remember I was having a discussion in school. So I was going to Warwick High School, which is a majority Black school. It is, for those of you that are into football, it's the alma mater of Michael Vick. So, it kind of went put on the map because of that. Mostly, probably 80% Black, but I was in the International Baccalaureate program, which was probably 95% white. And we're in this class, we're in 10th grade, the history class. And I remember one of the guys, his name is Chris. I actually still talk to him on Facebook to this day. Good guy, but at the time I didn't see it that way, right? So he was Greek, or he's an American, but he pulled on his Greek heritage. And somehow in the class, we started talking about, race and racism and the history of America. And he raises his hand and he says, I just don't get it. I don't understand why Black people cannot get it together. My people came here and made something of themselves. Italians came here and made something of themselves. Irish people came here and made something of themselves. I mean, he must have gone down the list. And he's like, I just don't get it. After all these years, after hundreds of years, they're still talking about something that happened in the past. Why can't they just figure it out? Now, mind you, I'm like, great, oh, pick me. Like, I'm beside myself, trying to. So the teacher kind of is telling me, let him finish first, let him finish his comments. So, she calls on me, of course. I begin to talk about, the 400-pound, 400-year elephant in the room. I begin to talk about slavery, and I begin to talk about Jim Crow in the South and redlining in the North, and all the things that people tend to hear about when they hear people begin to talk about historical disadvantage and all of that. And, afterwards, I remember Chris, he just kind of shakes his head and says, no, but still, this and that, and people need to get over it. And finally, there comes this point, this tension point in the conversation, and other people had joined in. He said, Darrell, look around. You're the only one in this class that really thinks that way. And I said, but I'm the only one that's Black. And before I could even get Black out, I'm sitting here like, but it was an eye-opening moment for me. That was before I went to Morehouse College. That was before I went to Harvard for law school. It was a good teaching moment for me, because it helped me to see that a lot of what we deal with is people stuck in their perspective. That's a human nature trait. That's not just owned by white folk, for lack of better words, right? That's something we all struggle with, where we get siloed in a specific thought a specific perspective, and we kind of just run with that. And it made me question even then, what are the things that are right in front of me that I don't see? Even if I don't agree with, what do I just blindly and willfully refuse to see? And I've come to really understand that a lot of times we don't see what we don't want to see. Sometimes we don't want to see it because it's hurtful. We don't want to see it because maybe it makes us feel uncomfortable. We don't want to see it because maybe we feel like we had a hand in it. And I'm not just talking about Juneteenth nationally, I mean, even personally. For those of you that know my personal story, I mean, I know what it's like to kind of look back at past moments and think, Darrell, you could have been a little bit better, right? And so what happens is, as human nature, I think we tend to, and Deekla and I were talking about this a bit earlier, we tend to paint with bright colors something or overlook what's glaringly there. And for me, that story stands for what we're still dealing with now. So Juneteenth is not the celebration of the end of slavery. I mean, it's just not. And I think the video made that clear. Juneteenth is the celebration of the awareness of the end of slavery. There was a distinct effort, a concerted, institutional, systematic effort to keep people unaware, to keep people blind, deaf, and dumb. Because really and this is what I want to talk about. This is my theme for today. I had one theme. I was going to talk about one thing, and I really thought about what could I share that I think would resonate with everybody. And I think it's something we can all pull from, not just collectively, not just as a company, but even personally. I think all of it can be summed up in 3 words: fear of change. That's what it comes down to. It's fear of change. It's fear of change. And I want to thread that throughout where we are even now through the pandemic. But let me go back to Juneteenth for a second. We have I think we do a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking with history. We look back at history and we tend to look at it from the vantage point of now, which is it's really not fair. Can you imagine what it must have been like for them to hear that slavery was over? When I say them, I'm not just talking about the folks who were enslaved. I'm talking about the people and institutions and organizations that were holding them and that were benefiting from it. Because there were a lot of people that benefited from this. So now there's this proclamation that's signed in 1863 that says, slavery's over. Okay, but what does that mean? In fact, and I do think it is important to point out, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed for the states that were still in the Union at the time. So not for the states that were not. So it basically what they say is where he could, talking about Lincoln, he didn't, and where he couldn't, he did. So basically it was a document that was befuddling and confusing on all ends. Because what does that look like? You say it's the end of slavery, but what does that mean? So you have an entire 2.5 years between January 1st, 1863, the signing or the effective date of this Emancipation Proclamation. And then in August, when the news reaches the last outpost in Galveston, Texas, that, hey, you've been freed. And you were free for a while, but what does that look like? I mean, what does it look like? Because when people talk about freedom, you have to beg the question, freedom for what? To do what? Freedom is not just freedom from, it's freedom to. That's why people come to this country. It's not just freedom from whatever's happening in their nation, it's freedom to. So people could not, Black folks I'm talking about, could not own land. They were told they could not vote. That changed, right around that time. Could not own money. Did not know how to read and write, most of them who had been enslaved at least. So you say free, but what does that mean? Because historically we treat it as if, the Emancipation Proclamation signed it and that was it. It was confusing for everybody. And can I say this, and I say this carefully, it wasn't just confusing and angering to white slaveholders and organizations that were holding them in the South. It was confusing for Black folks as well, because there was a hierarchy that was in place. There was a hierarchy. There were people who, because I look a little bit more like that person and I live in the house, I'm kind of comfortable. I may not have everything they have, but I'm a little bit better than that person. Everybody loves to, that's human nature. We all love to point to somebody that we're a little bit better than. Take the guy that was barefooted and coffee and we're like, hey, he may not know where his dinner's coming tonight, but I feel like I'm a little better than you. And so what happens is with fear of change is, what does this look like? What does it look like? So now, wait a minute, we have an entire group of people who are here that are now free, so that it means that they can vote. And wait a minute, if they vote, can they hold office? And if they hold office, does that mean other racial groups can? What does that look like? Now you fast forward to 2020, and I think you have to draw the connection of how many people were scared. I'm talking about people who are present day landowners, right? Folks who are in positions of power and authority and hold rank over these institutions, who said, wait a minute, no. You come to work, I don't care what's going on. It was fear of change. What does it look like when now we live in a world where people are remote, people come to work when they want, or they choose not to? What does it look like when now women not just have the right to vote, but they're now holding offices? This is what I want to say. This is bigger than a racial thing. We're still having the conversation, even in the Black church, as to whether or not women can preach. Really? I was just having this conversation a month ago with someone. He said, well, that's out of order because, the man is the head of the household. I said, is he? And he said, yeah, because the scripture says that, that the man is the head. I said, does it? Or is that what we say because it makes us feel better? Because again, we always like to point to things and places and historical fallacies oftentimes, and untruths and mistruths in order to, it's human nature, in order to justify why we are the way we are. It's fear of change. Because what does that look like? You said, Dekla, that it wasn't just Juneteenth we're celebrating this month, but even you talk about Pride Month. What does it look like when people can sort of, wherever you stand on the discussion, but where people determine what their pronouns are and what their gender is? What does that look like? And so I think what we saw, and I'm not making a political point, I'm making a historical point, what we saw 4 years ago and 6 years ago, what we're still seeing is people cling to the past when it's a fear of moving forward. Even if the past didn't work, even if the past was screwed up, we still have this innate human desire to say it was better then, it was better when. It's almost this romanticization, this nostalgization of dysfunction. And so I think when we look at what Juneteenth was, it was a disrupting event. We talk about disruption in companies. It was the most radical and disruptive event that perhaps happened in all of American history. Because what does this look like now? And how do we navigate the new normal? That's what we're still talking about today, in a different space, in a different place, in different times, but it's the same plot that has been threaded through. How do we navigate a normal that doesn't look like what it used to look like, where the people in power aren't the ones who maybe were in power before? Do we embrace that change? Knowing certainly that not all change is good, conceitedly, but some change certainly is. Or do we hearken back to the days of the past? I want to pull up a slide. This slide was really, I want to give you some context here. Can I share the screen? Okay, yeah. I want to show you this. Can everybody see this slide right here?
Yes.
This slide shows, this is by the Federal Reserve. So, because I want to talk about fear of change and what that looks like. The Federal Reserve released a finding. This is not from some third-party backdoor website to, somehow back up what I'm trying to say. This is the Federal Reserve that released this at the end of Q1 in 2020 to show the wealth disparity in this country. And what they showed in this country, we don't even have to go and look at internationally. We don't have to touch how so many conglomerates, international, Western institutions are touching everything. We can just talk about in this country, $100 trillion in assets being held by white households. Now you see Black, you see Hispanic, and you see other, don't even make up 10% of that. it look like if that changes? There's an interest. I want to keep this slide up for a second. There's an interest in keeping this way. See, the good news of the Emancipation Proclamation, the pictures of everybody dancing, everybody was not dancing. Certainly not. How could they be? Because for some people, they were losing their wealth. They were losing their control. They were losing their power. They were losing everything that mattered to them. And in fact, if I had time, which I won't, because I don't want to get into that, I would really talk about the fact that I think it is a historical inaccuracy that we tend to act like the South was any more racially motivated than the North. The North was interested in letting slaves go because the landholders in the South were the ones that held the wealth, whereas in the North, it was the corporations. So what the end of that type of slavery did was release people from physical bondage, but then kept them in an economic bondage that actually benefited the Northern classes. But I don't even want to touch that because we'd be here for another hour. But there's an interest in keeping it this way. I think whenever we talk about why things are the way they are, we have to talk about why things have not changed. Robert Kennedy said, some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and ask why not. Why not has this changed? Why not still are we dealing with this level of disparity? And you have people who have the nerve to say that further along because they worked harder. Really? Many things can be true at once. You may have worked hard. I'm not doubting that. You may have done a lot of great things over your life. When I stepped foot into Harvard Law School, it was the first time I ever met families that I had studied. It was the first time I ever met a Kennedy. It was the first time I ever met Rothschilds. It was the first time I ever met people that I was like, wow. People that when folks would walk in the class, you whisper, you know, their family is such and such and so. But to suggest that these people are where they are simply because of hard work and not historical advantage is intellectually dishonest, and it's historically inaccurate. It doesn't mean that we're bad people to say we benefit from a privilege. I'm going to take it to me. I'm going to go back to the Black church, still having the conversation about folks preaching that are not men. I am keenly aware that if I were born a woman, in my race, in my ethnicity, in my city, but born a woman, there's certain opportunities that I've had in my life that I don't believe I would have had. And yes, I think I've worked very hard. Yes, I do think I'm a very eloquent person and smart and all that other stuff, but I also admit and understand that there is a historical privilege that even I benefit from. Were I born in Togo, on the side of a mountain, I don't think I would have done the same things that I did now, even with the mindset I have. So the question is, how do we begin to make a change here? Now that we know that there's an interest in keeping it this way, now that we know that there's a reason to keep it this way, how do we begin to have a serious, honest, and real conversation, I'm coming to the end, about what do we do with this? The first thing is, I think we have to ask ourselves whenever there's change and there's fear, because whenever there is change, there is fear. I mean, come on, there is fear. We fear what we don't know. We fear the unknown. I think we have to ask ourselves, why do I fear it? Why do I have a problem? As I had a conversation with someone said, well, if a woman's president, then what? The husband is the first man or the first. I'm like, is that the only reason we're not voting for the woman here? I just want to be very clear because we're trying to figure out what the husband's going to be called. Is that the sticking point? Because if it was another sticking point, we could have a longer conversation. But is that what we're scared of? I don't know about a military general saluting a person that's a woman. Really? But that's where so the question is, why do we fear change? Knowing that the best companies, the brightest companies, the most innovative companies, countries, empires are the ones that are on the cutting edge. I'm gonna speak historically about the Hebrew people for a second. The sons of Issachar knew the signs of the times. That's why they were ahead. Do you know the signs of the times? Or are we, like everybody else, still stuck getting dragged into what's inevitably going to happen? I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we afraid of, first of all? Maybe it is a bad change. Again, I don't think all change is good. Maybe it is a change that's going to create something that we shouldn't have. But if in the fear of change, we stay in the fear, then what happens? And I say this carefully, but I say it confidently because I think it has to be said. For those who are students of history, this is a fascinating period to live in. For those who studied the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s and what was happening in Europe, you see that the characters have changed, but the plot has not. You see what happens when people hold on to fear and they scapegoat. And they point to folks and say, this is why I'm having this problem. Not this. I'm not poor and not getting money because of this. I'm talking about even within this is still held by a very few number of families. But I'm poor and I'm locked out of the system because of these people. Really? Because of the Mexicans. It's the Mexicans. That's why I didn't get in the heart. I heard people say that. It's all these people with affirmative action. If you think that affirmative action has kept you out of any school that you have applied to, you probably did not understand the admissions process. You certainly didn't understand the legacy clause because the legacy clause is going to give you a leg up more than anything else can. But that's what happens. We point to things that aren't really true because fear causes us to do it. And then in anger, we find ourselves pulling back. And this is really where I want to end. And Israel, bear with me for a second. This is where I put on my patriotic hat. I care about this country. I really do. I think America has the opportunity and has had the opportunity to lead the world. Even in all of our stuff, I think what makes America great, really, and it's not about again, because we've always been great, is that we have the ability to understand and recognize, yes, we had a poor past in some instances, but it is from that past that we can have a better compassion for people. The most beautiful people, I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who said, are people who've known defeat, known hurt, known sadness, known pain. Beautiful people don't just happen. I believe the reason why in this country we have a heart for freedom. We have a heart when we see what's happening over in other parts of the world. When there's a bombing, we feel in our hearts because there's something innate here where we saw, even if we didn't fully recognize that, wow, some of that was happening here. But I'm nervous that we pull away rather than leaning into the space that we could really, truly shine from. And I think if we embrace this moment as a nation and as people and as personally, I think our future can be so much brighter. Last analogy, this is a pullback. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of things going on in this country. You know, the shootings, all those things, but a lot of those things were happening. It's just now they're being publicized. Sometimes you got to go under the x-ray. That's one of the first things the doctors will do. You got to get the x-ray so we can get the right diagnosis. We keep trying to diagnose something, but not being honest about what's really happening under the surface. It's not enough to look at it and say, well, we got to see how deep the wound is. But I think we have this opportunity now to really truly turn a course, and just like stocks, great companies trending upward, there's a pullback. Yeah, there's been a bit of a pullback. I believe, though, this country is still built on a solid foundation. The question is, what do we do now? And the irony is, that was Dr. King's last book before he was killed. It was his last book, 1967. Where do we go from here? Community or chaos? And that's really the question I have. Where do we go from here? community of chaos. I don't think we should have fear of change. All right, so I want to open it up for questions or comments. And thank you again for listening. I really do appreciate it and for this opportunity.
Darrell, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So this is a hard topic, right? The whole thing, it's hard. Like, it's hard to swallow, because what you had said at the beginning was people fear change, right? And people don't know what to do. There's a lot of people that are scared. No one wants to be labeled, right? No one wants to be labeled. No one wants to feel like they're not doing the right thing, and so they don't do anything, right? So you talked about taking the opportunity to lean in. What does that mean from your perspective? Like, talk a little bit about what that means to you.
Yeah, Chassie, that's a great
action.
question. Yeah, and the labeling has to stop, because I think then that's why I was even cognizant which words, certain words just take people places. You know, you hear white privilege and automatically it's just, some people's ears are just tuned off, and that's not helpful. Do you want people to listen, or do you just want to yell? I think to answer that question, I'll answer it this way. I was recently watching the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. I don't remember his name, but the gentleman was actually having a press or not a conference. He was talking to one of the congressmen on the Senate floor. Actually, it was on the House floor, and a representative was kind of questioning him about critical race theory and whether or not people should be learning that at West Point, because the representative said that people at West Point were becoming woke. I don't even know what that fully means, but it was interesting to hear him say that. And the general said, look, he said, I've read Mao Zedong's book. I've read, Paul de Paz. He listed all of the books he read personally, and then many of the books that are in the West Point curriculum. And he said, I don't think we should be scared of teaching critical race theory, because I think that our soldiers are strong enough, and I resent that people would feel otherwise. He said, our soldiers are strong enough to hear something, and if they don't like it, reject it. So I think the start is educating ourselves, you know, to not get so stuck, Chastity, in, because I think that's part of leaning in. I think sometimes fear makes us not even want to, we don't even want to hear it. We don't even want to hear. We're now at a place where now they're trying to call it project, 1619, and words are important, people. We know that. Now they want to call it the transatlantic triangular trade. Because slavery is, oh, wait, we don't want to say that. That makes it sound, So what happens is there's some people that's like, I don't even really want to talk about it at all, because that brings up such bad feelings and such bad things. And if I could just say really quickly, we like to think that history is so further in the past than what it is. Harriet Tubman, when she was born, Thomas Jefferson was alive, and by the time she died, Ronald Reagan was alive. He wasn't president, but he was alive. My father got on integrated buses. History wasn't that long ago. So we tend to think it is, and especially if we have a hand in it. So I think the first thing is to educate ourselves, really educate ourselves. Doesn't mean we accept everything. I've heard things that I'm thinking, that's a bit out there. It's out there. But I still wanted to educate myself more. I too read Mao Zedong's book. I too read that. I've read some of the books from some of the leaders, if you want to call it, I'll call them misleaders of the 1930s, because I was just interested to know, what were people reading then? Because somebody read it and somebody then was eating this. I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is to have the conversation, and even being honest about it. Say, look, I don't agree with this, maybe, and then hearing what the other person maybe says, because maybe you pick something up. Because I know that I have. I don't feel the same way that I did. This will be the last point. If I had grown up and stayed in Baltimore City, I would have a very myopic point of view. And I would not be able to see, I think, the way that I see about the world, because it still would have been coming from this one prism. So having the conversations helps as well.
Darrell, maybe I would even add one more thing into that. And first of all, thank you for sharing all that with us. And maybe take it even one step further. I think educating ourselves and hearing other people is very important. I think we also need to be acknowledged, not to live in a vacuum, kind of to get outside of our bubble. I'll give a short example. And in Israel, we have challenges with the Jewish and Arab communities. You can live your own life without actually know any Arabs, and vice versa. and all you hear is bad stuff and stuff like that. One of the thing that at my one of my daughters, she's a second grader, and a week ago they had like a field trip to a nearby town, which most of the community there are Arabs, and they visited the school and had typical lunch with them and had like a bonding day. And from that moment, I believe that's going to change her life about the Jewish and Arab conflict. It's not kind of something that you read or heard people or heard stories about it. It's actually people that she met, that she shared nice experience with them. I truly believe that that's going to be kind of a pivotal moment from her perspective. And the change here is actually reaching outside of your community. My daughter could live a full life here in Israel without actually go one day into Arab school and understand the dynamic and talk to them and hear a few words and kind of have that bonding. So the point that I'm trying to drive here is, while we're educating and hearing other opinions, we need to get outside of our bubble and reach out, get outside of our communities, outside of our comfort zone. And, you know, when you have kids, it's kind of, I see that even as a high responsibility, because that will make the change. That will make it's not ideas, it's not something that you read, it's people. It's just people like you that have similar needs, have similar that, and that kind of taking that to the next step.
Darrell, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for the bluntness of kind of how you presented this. I think there was a lot within what you talked about that like I didn't know. And especially when it comes to the immediate fallout of emancipation. I think that's never something that I was taught or was never in a history book, right, for me growing up. And it should be in a really, really strong way. And I think when it comes to, you know, what education looks like that's a systemic problem. You know, and I never thought about that, was never presented with that information. It was not all sunshine and rainbows, obviously, right? And I think that's an incredible thing. And thank you for presenting all of that. This was extremely, extremely eye-opening, even for somebody who grew up in a very diverse state, in a very diverse part of a state, right? You know, there's a lot here to unpack. So thank you for this.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. Thank you. History is written by winners.
Darrell, I was just going to say that. History is written by the winners.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, Darrell. I'd love
to,
you know, first of all, thank you. I really appreciated everything you said.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I would love to get your perspective. So I'm a huge Cory Booker fan and very supportive of the bill that he's sponsoring around. I think they like, in terms of mass media, they call it baby bonds, but in terms of really being able to kind of take away kind of that wealth gap, I'd love to hear your perspective on it and, you know, what you think about in terms of how we can potentially better support that going forward, if you think it's a good thing or not.
Yeah, to full transparency, I've read a little bit about the bill, not as much as I probably should have, definitely not as much as I could have. But I am aware of some efforts, even on his part, to really start to close that gap. I think that's the beginning. I mean, it's a step. It's going to take a lot of things. I mean, you know, it's going to, I'll bring it to Panda logic here. You know how we go and we tell clients, look, you don't just want us if you want better recruiting. We're one piece of it, but there's other things that you're going to need in your tech stack. It's the same analogy here. I think there's going to be a multiplicity of things that need to change. I think that's the start of it, you know, the baby bonds. I also think the educational piece, and I don't just mean the schooling piece. How do you really re-educate people? It's so that you know, I think that's really one of the biggest places, because now we're at a point where that miseducation has not just affected the institutions and organizations that we are seeking to change, let's say from the top, but it's also affected the institutions, organizations, and people that we're seeking to change from the bottom, if that makes sense. Because when it's gone so long that, you know, I was just hearing someone say the other day, it was a pastor, and he said it quite bluntly. He said, look, when for generations, the only thing you were good for was reproducing. Now I see why you're standing out on the corner with your hand doing your thing. You know, I'm being respectful, but I want to go somewhere with this because that's what you know. That's what you were taught to breed, and you were taught to. So we're still dealing with this systematic, it's a lot of unbecoming that has to happen. There's a lot of things that even we're being taught. You know, if you get a chance to read, I don't know how many people have ever read the Willie Lynch letter. It's a powerful letter, but if you, just by show of hands, how many people have read that letter? You get a chance, Google the Willie Lynch letter. And now they're trying to say, oh, it wasn't a real letter. You know, this is a historical rewriting, but really 120 seconds. The Willie Lynch letter was a letter written in 1712, so about 300 and some years ago. And he was a slave owner in the West Indies who was basically brought in as a consultant, as it were, by slave owners in the United States in the South because they were rebelling and they weren't able to keep control. And he said, y'all doing this all wrong. First of all, the people you're enslaving are running you. They're burning things down. They're not working the way they should. We have a much better model here in the West Indies. And what he does is he likens it to breaking of a horse. And he talks about how, you got to read the letter. I don't have time to get into it, but he talks about how there's a way of how to domesticate the horse. It doesn't happen in the first generation. In fact, many ways, the first generation, you already know that they're just not going to maybe be broken. But if you can break a couple generations, and if you do it right, the horse will then teach their offspring what's acceptable and what's not. And what he was explaining was, you're trying to control people by their bodies. That's never going to work, because the minute that the chains come off, you'll lose control. But if you can control their minds, and I can say that some of the people that told me first that it was no way that I could do some of the things that I've achieved in life were people who look like me. So, and I say that to say we're dealing with something that's larger than just give people some money or give people a few classes and this is going to change this. This is deep. And it's been going on for centuries. And this isn't about blame, but it's about acknowledgement. So I think, you know, and on this point, I think what I have to say about that is we have to really begin to ask ourselves, even what we're teaching in the home, like, what are the things on all ends? What are the things that we're saying? Are we killing people's dreams before they even make it outside for someone else to tell them? And Willie Lynch even went as far as to say, if you do it right, the person that's the master will actually seem like the savior and come in and say, oh no, what your mother said isn't really true. You can do this, this, and that, but let me show you how. Because out of protection, the mother tells the child what they can and cannot be, but it's really, is it out of protection or is it out of, again, fear? So we have a lot of things to do, but part of it definitely is that. And part of it is definitely an acknowledgement. I'll just say this, there has to be an acknowledgement, and not just that, an amends, because there's a difference. By companies, and there are many, and organizations, and there are many who have benefited from Jim Crow in the South, redlining in the North, and the transatlantic slave trade that are still today. And they should be made to put certain monies into a pool and that be dispersed in some way. But I think there has to be some economic amends from folks who have benefited from that gap that I showed there. And they're still benefiting. They're still benefiting.
Thanks, Darrell.
Thank you.
Darrell, thanks for this. It was super helpful. And for those of you who don't know, I have a mixed family myself. And I just wanted to tell a quick story. I sat on the board of a business women's professional group, and they were having a family picnic during the summer for everyone to come and just kind of get together. We had all seen each other professionally once a month in a recurring meeting, but we never had our families at those meetings. So they had a summer picnic, and in true fashion, we were late. So my husband had dropped me and the kids off, and he had gone to park the car, and he came back, and we had already gone through the line to get food. and sat down, and my husband went to get in the line, and a woman, the vice president of the group, stopped him and told him that he wasn't welcome there and that the food was for members of the professional women's group and their families, and let him know that he could go back over to the other side of the park where he should be. And he looked at her and said, "Okay, thank you for that information," and started to get his food. And the woman said, "Sir, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to leave." And I walked up because I could see that there was something going on and I didn't really understand. And he's like, "Jill, please tell this woman who I am." And I looked at her, I'm like, "What's wrong?" And she goes, "Well, who is this?" And I said, "Well, that's my husband." And she looked at me with this look of just, she had known that she had made an assumption that this was someone who wasn't supposed to be there, and he was completely supposed to be there. So I share that with you because everyone always asks, like, how can you change? And there's all these, things that we can do, but sometimes it just starts with asking the question instead of assuming what the answer is.
That's a good point.
So I just wanted to share that.
That's a good point.
So needless to say, I don't belong to that club anymore. Not because it was super hard to go back, but I did go back and I explained to the women in that organization that I had belonged to the organization for 3 years. It never really dawned on me that I would have to provide a picture of my family and explain who everyone was. I just, and it was a great learning opportunity for our organization, that there are people that are different, that we shouldn't make assumptions, but long term, I just couldn't overcome the fact that someone would just jump in who was, it's just the acknowledgement, like, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm the vice president of the organization. How are you related to this organization?" That would have stopped that. That would have changed the whole trajectory of that. So I think, like, there's these small moments where we can all decide, like, do we want to just assume why someone's supposed to be there, or assume why someone's feeling a certain way, or assume based on a social media post that someone feels a certain way, instead of just sitting down. I think every person I've ever had issue with on social media, once you talk to them in person, it changes because you have that communication. And I think just because we move to different forms of communication, I think, Darrell, you said it right. These things have been happening for a long time. I can't even tell you how many times my husband's been pulled over in the city we live in and told he was a drug dealer, told he was selling drugs, and we're delivering Girl Scout cookies. Like, it happens so often that we just become immune to it. And we know, like, hey, like, the car is in a certain, like, his name, and the insurance is in his name. It's all listed first, so that when he shows the insurance card and the registration card, his name is first on both documents. So there's no doubt about it, instead of mine. So I think it happens so often that we're more and more immune to it. But the one thing that I can say that people can do that's really simple is just choose to be empathetic and ask before assuming. So I'll just say that. And thanks,
Thank
Darrell.
you, Jill. No, thank you for that, Jill.
Yeah.
Hey, Darrell, that's a beautiful tree you just planted there, giving us shade. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Danny. That's my Pando pal for life.
And the pal for life. I really appreciate everybody's share. I think it's awesome. Moti, I'm really touched by also your daughter getting to get that interaction as well. I think it goes around. Just real quick, I meditate a lot, and just to reflect off of this, one of the things and one of my I don't know, teachings, I guess, is to be curious, not to judge. And I think that's something that we can all take and go from there. It's like to have that open mind and to take situations and to be curious, not, for your wife, for your husband, Jill, that's terrible. I mean, I think we should all, assumptions are terrible, and we should always remain curious, I think. And hopefully, as generations go on, these old ways, these old beliefs will slowly melt away. And thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, Darrell. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. And shalom. So it's had 2 Hebrew words.
Darrell,
Darrell.
I can't express in enough words. I think how fulfilling this was and so interesting to listen, to hear, to learn more about the meaning, the purpose. What does day to day look like? And Jill, thank you so much for sharing that story. I think it's very impactful, just real life. And thanks to everyone for joining. For me, it was an amazing session. So really, thank you very much, Darrell.
Thank you. See you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Darrell.
Thank you.